Elliot, having installed the mattress in his spacious apartment on the left bank, returned to the Riviera at the end of the year. He had planned his house to suit his own convenience, and there was no room in it for a family of four, so that even if he had wanted to, he could not have had them stay with him there. I do not think he regretted it. He was well aware that as a man by himself, he was a more desirable asset than if he must be accompanied by a niece and nephew, and he could hardly expect to arrange his own distinguished little parties, a matter for which he took intense trouble, if he had to count invariably on the presence of two house guests. It's much better for them to settle down in Paris and accustom themselves to civilized life. Besides, the two girls are old enough to go to school, and I've found one not far from my apartment, which I'm assured is very select. In consequence of this, I did not see Isabel until the spring when, because I had some work to do, made it desirable for me to spend some weeks there. I went to Paris and took a couple of rooms in the hotel just out of the Palace Vendôme. It was a hotel I frequented not only for its convenient situation, but because it had an air. It was a big old house built around a courtyard, and it had been an inn for close upon 200 years. The bathrooms were far from luxurious, and the plumbing far from satisfactory. The bedrooms, with their iron beds painted white, their old-fashioned white counterpanes, and their huge armoires de glace, had poverty-stricken look. But the parlors were furnished with fine old furniture. The sofa, the armchairs, dated from the gaudy reign of Napoleon III, and though I could not say they were comfortable, they had a florid charm. In that room, I lived in the past of the French novelists. When I looked at the Empire clock under its glass case, I thought that a pretty woman in ringlets and a flounced dress might have watched the minute hand move as she waited for a visit from Rastignac, the well-born adventurer whose career in novel after novel Balzac followed from his humble beginnings to his ultimate grandeur. Dr. Bianchon, the physicist, who was so real to Balzac that when he lay dying, he said, "Only Bianchon can save me," might well have come into that room to feel the pulse and look at the tongue of a noble dowager from the Providence who had come to Paris to see an attorney about a lawsuit and had called in a doctor for a passing ailment. At that bureau, a lovesick woman in crinoline, her hair parted in the middle, may have written a passionate letter to her faithless lover, or a peppery old gentleman in a green frock coat and a stock indited an angry epistle to his extravagant son. The day after my arrival, I called up Isabel and asked if she would give me a cup of tea if I came along at 5. It was 10 years since I'd seen her. She was reading a French novel when I was ushered into the drawing room by a staid butler. And getting up, she took both my hands and greeted me with a warm and winning smile. I had never seen her more than a dozen times, and only twice alone, but she made me feel at once that we were not casual acquaintances, but old friends. The 10 years that had passed had reduced the gulf that separated the young girl from the middle-aged man, and I was no longer conscious of the disparity of age between us. With the delicate flattery of a woman of the world, she treated me as if I were her contemporary, and in 5 minutes we were chatting as frankly and as unconstrainedly as though we were playmates who had been in the habit of meeting without interruption. She had acquired ease, self-possession, and assurance. But what chiefly struck me was the change in her appearance. I remembered her as a pretty bouncing girl who threatened to run to fat. I do not know whether, realizing this, she had taken heroic measures to reduce her weight or whether it was an unusual though happy accident of childbearing. But now she was slender as anyone could wish. The mode of moment accentuated this. She was in black, and at a glance I noticed that her silk dress, neither too plain nor too fancy, had been made by one of the best dressmakers in Paris, and she wore it with the careless confidence of a woman to whom it is second nature to wear expensive clothes. 10 years before, even with Elliot to advise, her frocks had been somewhat on the showy side, and she had worn them as though she were not quite at home in them. Marie-Louise Flormont could not have said now that she lacked chic. She had chic to the tips of her rose-painted nails. Her features had fine down, and it occurred to me that she had as pretty and as straight a nose as I ever had seen on a woman's face. There was not a line on her forehead or under her hazel eyes, and though her skin had lost the fresh bloom of extreme youth, its texture was as fine as ever. It obviously owed something now to lotions, creams, and massage, but they had given it a soft, transparent delicacy that was singularly attractive. Her thin cheeks were very faintly rouged, and her mouth was painted with discretion. She wore her bright brown hair, bobbed as was the fashion in the moment, and marcelled. She had no rings on her fingers, and I remember that Elliot had told me that she had sold her jewelry. Her hands, though not remarkably small, were well made, and that period woman wore short frocks in the daytime, and I saw that her legs in champagne-colored stockings were shapely, long, and slender. Legs are the undoing of many comely women. Isabel's legs as a girl, her most unfortunate trait, were now uncommonly good. In fact, from the pretty girl whose glowing health, high spirits, and brilliant color had given her attractiveness, she was become a beautiful woman. That she owed her beauty in some degree to art, discipline, mortification of the flesh, did not seem to matter. The result was vastly satisfactory. It might be that the grace of her gestures, the felicity of her carriage, had been acquired by taking thought, but they had the look of perfect spontaneity. I conceived the notion that these 4 months in Paris had put the finishing touches to a work of conscious art that had been in the years making. Elliot, even in his most censor's mood, could not but have approved of her. I, a person less difficult to please, found her ravishing. Gray had gone to Mortefontaine to play golf, but she told me he would be in presently. And you must see my 2 girls. They've gone to the tourist gardens, but they ought to be in soon. They're sweet. We talked of one thing and another. She liked being in Paris, and they were very comfortable in Elliot's apartment. Before leaving them, he had made them acquainted with such of his friends as he thought they would like, and they had already a pleasant circle of acquaintances. He had pressed them to entertain as abundantly as he had been in the habit of doing. You know, it tickles me to death to think that we're living like quite rich people when we're really absolutely broke. Is it all as bad as that? She chuckled, and now I remember the light, gay laugh that I had found so pleasing in her 10 years before. Gray hasn't a penny, and I've almost exactly the same income Larry had when he wanted me to marry him, and I wouldn't because I thought we couldn't possibly live on it. And now I've got 2 children besides. It's rather funny, isn't it? I'm glad you can see the joke of it. What news have you of Larry? None. I hadn't set eyes on him since before you were last in Paris. I knew slightly some of the people he used to know, and I did ask them what had become of him, but that was years ago. No one seemed to know anything about him. He just vanished. We know the manager of the bank in Chicago where Larry has his account, and he told us that every now and then he gets a draft from some queer place, China, Burma, India. He seems to have been getting around. I did not hesitate to put the question that came to the tip of my tongue. After all, if you want to know something, the best way is to ask. Do you wish now that you had married him? She smiled engagingly. I've been very happy with Gray. He's been a wonderful husband. You know, until the crash came, we had a grand time together. We like the same people and we like doing the same thing. He's very sweet and it's nice being adored. He's just as much in love with me now as when we first married. He thinks I'm the most wonderful girl in the world. You can't imagine how kind and considerate he is. It was quite absurd how generous he was. You see, he thought nothing was too good for me. Do you know, he's never said an unkind or harsh thing to me in all these years we've been married. Oh, I've been very lucky. I asked myself if she thought she'd answered my question. I changed the conversation. Tell me about you little girl, your little girls. As I spoke, the doorbell rang. Here they are, you shall see for yourself. In a moment they came in, followed by a nursery governess, and I was introduced first to Joan, the elder, and then to Priscilla. Each in turn gave a polite little nick as she took my hand. One was 8 and the other 6. They were tall for their age. Isabel, of course, was tall and gray. I remembered was immense. But they were pretty only in the way all children are pretty. They looked frail. They had their father's black hair and their mother's hazel eyes. The presence of a stranger did not make them shy, and they talked eagerly to her of the doings in the garden. They cast eager eyes on the dainties Isabel's cook had provided for tea, but which neither of us had touched, and being given permission to have one thing, were thrown into small agony of doubt as to which to choose. It was pleasant to see the demonstrative affection they had for their mother, and the 3 of them clustered together made a charming picture. When they had eaten the little cake each had selected, Isabel sent them away, and they went without word of expostulation. I received the impression that she was bringing them up to do as they were told. When they were gone, I said the usual things one says to a mother about her children, and Isabel accepted my compliments with evident but somewhat casual pleasure. I asked her how Gray was liking Paris. Well enough. Uncle Elliot left us a car so he can go and play golf almost every day, and he's joined a travelers club and he plays bridge there. Of course, Uncle Elliot's offer to support us in this apartment has been a godsend. Gray's nerves went all to pieces. He still has those terrible headaches. Even if he could get a job, he isn't really fit to take it, and naturally that worries him. He wants to work. He feels he ought to, and it humiliates him not to be wanted. You see, he feels like it's a man's business to work, and if he can't work, he may just as well be dead. He can't bear his feelings of being a drag on the market, and I only got him to come by here by persuading him that rest and change would bring him back to normalcy. But I know he won't be happy till he gets back into the harness. I'm afraid you've had a very rough time these last 2.5 years. Well, you know, when the crash came, at first I simply couldn't believe it. It seemed inconceivable to me that we should be ruined. I could understand that other people should be ruined, but that we should be, well, it just seemed impossible. I went on thinking that something would happen to save us at the last moment, and then when the final blow came, I felt that life wasn't worth living anymore. I didn't think I could face the future. It was too black. For a fortnight, I was absolutely miserable. God, it was awful having to part with everything, knowing there wouldn't be any fun anymore, having to do without everything I liked. And then at the end of the fortnight, I said, oh, to hell with it. I'm not going to give it another thought, and I promise you I never have. I don't regret anything. I had a lot of fun while it lasted, and now it's gone. It's gone. It's obvious that ruin is easier to bear in a luxurious apartment in a fashionable quarter with a competent butler and an excellent cook, free and for nothing, and when one can cover one's haggard bones with a dress by Chanel, isn't it? Land then, she giggled. I see you haven't changed much in 10 years. I don't suppose you'll believe being a cynical brute, but I'm not sure if I'd have accepted Uncle Elliot's offer except for Gray and the children. On my $2,800 a year, we could have managed perfectly well on the plantation and would have grown rice and rye and corn and kept pigs. After all, I was born and raised on a farm in Illinois. In a manner of speaking, I smiled, knowing that, point of fact, she had been born in an expensive clinic in New York. At this point, Gray came in. It's true that I had only seen him 2 or 3 times 12 years before, but I seen a photograph of him with his bride. Elliot kept it in a splendid frame on his piano, along with signed photographs of the King of Sweden, the Queen of Spain, and the Dr. Geis, and I had a fair recollection of him. I was taken aback. His hair had receded on the temples, and there was a small... What are you doing? Get out of my face. Let me read. His hair receded on his temples, and there was a small bald patch on the crown. His face was puffy and red, and he had a double chin. He had put on a lot of weight during years of living and hard drinking, and only his great height saved him from being grossly obese. But the thing I noticed was the expression of his eyes. I remember quite well the trusting, open frankness of their Irish blue, when the world was before him and he hadn't a care in the world. Now I seem to see in a sort of puzzled dismay. Even if I hadn't known the facts, I think I might have guessed that something had occurred to destroy his confidence in himself and the ordered course of events. I felt a kind of diffidence with him, as though he had done wrong, though unwittingly, and were ashamed. It was plain that his nerve was shaken. He greeted me with pleasant cordiality, and indeed seemed as glad to see me as if I were an old friend. But I had the impression that his rather noisy heartiness was a habit of matter that scarcely corresponded with his inner feelings. Drinks were brought in, and he mixed us a cocktail. Had played a couple rounds of golf and was satisfied with his game. He went into somewhat verbose detail over the difficulties he had surmounted over one of the holes. Isabel listened with appearance of lively interest. After a few minutes, having made a date to take them to dine and see a play, I left.